Good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. I'm Regina Yao, and I'm the founder and president of the Pixel Project. I'm moderating the fourth Read for Pixels panel in a series of live stream panel sessions with authors and editors held as part of the launch of our first ever charity anthology, Giving the Devil His Due. So this panel is also part of the Pixel Project's program for Domestic Violence Awareness Month 2021, which kicked off on the 1st of October 2021. So this anthology is part of our Read for Pixels program, through which we work with award-winning best-selling authors to raise awareness and funds for our work to end violence against women and girls. Today's YouTube session is also our 9th Read for Pixels live stream author panel. The Pixel Project created these multi-author panel sessions to be an accessible resource for writers interested in writing about female characters and approaching themes such as misogyny, sexism, gender, and violence against women with depth, empathy, and accuracy. And what better topic for our anthology panel session series than No More Final Girls, Smashing Negative Female Stereotypes in Horror. And here to participate in tonight's session are 3 acclaimed horror authors who have all contributed wonderfully spine-chilling and thought-provoking stories to our anthology. Beneath me is, literally under me right now, is Kenesha Williams. Kenesha is an author and the founder and editor-in-chief of Black Girl Magic Lit Mag. She loves speculative fiction and writes in the horror, science fiction, and urban fantasy genres. And next to me is Linda D. Addison. Linda is the award-winning author of 5 collections, including How to Recognize a Demon Has Become Your Friend, the first African-American recipient of the HWA, I think it's Horror Writer Association, yes, Bram Stoker Award, received the HWA Mentor of the Year Award and the HWA Lifetime Achievement Award. And beneath Linda, literally on the screen, is Nicholas Kaufmann. Nick is a horror and dark fantasy author whose fiction has been nominated for the Bram Stoker Award, the Shirley Jackson Award, the Thriller Award, and the Dragon Award. And in addition to his own original work, he has written for Zombies vs. Robots, The Rocketeer, and Warhammer. So you, the audience, will be able to ask them questions live. Just make sure you're logged into your YouTube account so that you can type your questions into the chat box to the right of the YouTube screen. And Anusha, who is today's producer and chat box moderator, will relay them to me to read out to Kenesha, Linda, and Nick to answer. And for those of you who are interested in getting your very own copy of Giving the Devil His Due, I think Nick has a copy with him to Nick and Linda, show and tell. Yes. You can order the book from major booksellers worldwide, including Amazon, Kobo, Google Play, Book Depository, and more. And just a note here that publishers are having supply chain issues right now due to paper shortage, I think. And also the pandemic has caused havoc with shipping lines. So if y'all want the book in time for Christmas, and this is a special edition that's not going to be around for long, you better put in your order now or you're not going to get your book in time for Christmas or any of the year-end festivities. All net proceeds go towards keeping the Pixel Project's campaigns, programs, and initiatives such as this one alive and kicking. And now onwards to the panel session. Now, horror as a genre addresses the deepest fears and taboos of societies and cultures. It enables us to explore, dismantle, and overcome these fears and taboos in a more or less safe, contained, and also entertaining way. Horror as a genre in both modern and folk storytelling can also be deemed as a reflection of the patriarchy, as it has traditionally not been kind to women and other female figures. Fortunately, things seem to be changing because through the late 20th century until today, we are seeing the rise of more female-centric horror that doesn't make its female characters two-dimensional fodder for monsters of both the human and the supernatural kind. However, the patriarchy is still far from being smashed in much of horror. In certain subgenres of horror, sexism and misogyny seems to be built in, and violence against women far more visceral and extreme. Female characters are portrayed as everything from murderers to victims to the ultimate figures of evil that are faithful for men or are blamed for compelling men to commit atrocities. With that in mind, today's panel session will be discussing how to smash negative female stereotypes in horror, how to write better female characters in horror, and whether or not this can help move conversations about violence against women, toxic masculinity, and misogyny forward in a constructive way. And with that in mind, let's get the discussion started. Now, there has been a steady stream of discussion and critique over the years about female stereotypes and tropes in horror with a plethora of articles and papers analyzing everything from the woman is always the victim, to the airhead girl who is the first to die, to the final girl. However, horror as a genre seems to be taking the slow lane to change, as many of the most negative female stereotypes and tropes are still very much in use in both horror fiction and film. Do you think this is the case? And if so, why do you think this is happening? Linda?
Well, why it's happening is a whole nother scenario as far as I'm concerned, per the fear of the power of woman and her ability to give life. I mean, that's a whole psychological, sociological situation that is still a big problem in every country and every area, not just horror writing. So, there's that. And then I think in horror, I mean, I've done most of my writing has been horror focused. And I can say over the 40 years that I've been, working in the field, it has gotten better, but there's still so much more to be done. There's just so much more. And the point of it has been, I feel like in the last few years, more sort of attention when someone sends out an anthology table of contents or who they've accepted. And if they're not a good number of some diversity in there, not just women, but obviously women, then others are starting to call them out. And that's what makes the change, because I think that in many ways, what happens is people just, I call it almost like lazy editing. You put it out there, here's the spec, and we accept everybody, but you don't take into account the fact that socially, your acceptance of everyone has not always been fulfilled, and that you have to do a little extra work. So I think that is what is making change, and that needs to just continue.
Okay, Kenesha?
Piggybacking kind of off of the anthologies and editing and the lazy editing, I think another problem that I hear is that women are more likely to self-checkout. Like, I don't think I'm good enough, so I'm not going to submit. And, we don't put ourselves out there as much as men will do. And so you have to go to where women writers are, where people of color writers are, and say, we want your voice, because you'll second guess yourself if you don't see yourself reflected in other TOCs all the time. So you're like, well, am I good enough? Can women write horror? I find a lot of women write urban fantasy, but they're really writing horror. But they'll say it's urban fantasy because horror is looked at as a masculine genre. So I think a lot of times people don't even put themselves out there sometimes, and editors, they need to say, no, we are seeking your voice. And they need to be sincere about that, to really be wanting other voices in their anthologies to show the female perspective or the minority perspective, even though, women aren't a minority, so I think that helps too, when you go to the places where those writers are. And I think more people are doing that, because like Linda said, you will get called out if your table of contents is only men or the same men. Sometimes you'll see like the same men over and over and over and over again, and we want to hear other voices, because they have more to say, or they have, the new generation of horror writers have different things to say than horror writers of the past.
Nick?
I think Linda and Kenesha are spot on. I can think back to anthologies of horror that I read in the early 80s or going back to the 70s even. And the table of contents was all white men. And it's no longer really being stood for. It is being called out now. Uh, and you do still get a little bit of pushback too from some editors who say, well, I just chose the best stories, and it just so happens that they all happen to be from white men, which is baloney. I mean, you're obviously that they are looking at it through a certain lens, and they're reacting to the lens of a white male gaze in the story, and that's why they've chosen it. But I think that there is some strange sort of idea among some editors that if you put in an ounce of effort, if you actually try to attract female writers, if you try to attract writers of color, somehow it's not as legit because they didn't just come to you. Like it's this idea that if you it's what Linda called lazy editing. Oh, I'm just going to sit back and wait for the greatest stories to come to me, rather than putting in even a smidgen of effort to try to diversify your table of contents. The good
Yeah.
news is I think this is not necessarily anymore the slow lane. I really do think it is picking up. We're now in maybe the middle lane, maybe not the fast lane, but we're at least in the middle lane where I think there is a real urgency towards diversity in the horror genre, and we're seeing it more and more in mainstream press. I mean, there was a lot of particularly writers of color sort of relegated in a way to sort of the micro presses or the small presses, right? Because it was, for whatever reason, editors thought this was a very niche thing, right? Well, maybe only Black readers will read Black writers or whatever they were thinking. And I think that's really changing. We're seeing a lot more diversity in mainstream publishers. Tor Nightfire is doing a great job with the books that they're putting out of making sure that it's not just the same old white guys.
Yeah. And as I mentioned backstage just now, putting together the anthology that's brought us all together for this panel today, it was a really eye-opening process. You have to be really, really on the ball. You have to be making a lot of conscious decisions. You have to be looking at your TOC, how many slots you have for this book, and figuring out how to give everyone a seat at the table. Obviously, you can't give everyone a seat at the table because we have a limited number of pages per book. Not all of us have 1,000-page books. Like Alan Moore, he had a 1,000-page book, I think, come out once. But you really need to make a conscious decision. I think y'all are right. It's lazy to just pick from whoever sends in their stories, because as Linda and Kenesha said, it's usually women don't send in their stories often enough, and it's usually more male authors who send in their stories. So and even though some of the foremost horror authors, including Mary Shelley, Shirley Jackson, Tananarive Due, and Linda herself, who is with us today, are women, horror as a genre still seems to be really male-dominated and misogynistic. And there have been observations that it's not just the stories themselves. I mean, y'all were talking about the TOCs, right? But if you see if you ask about the best of lists, we're still seeing more male horror authors and books cited. If you go into horror groups or horror adjacent groups like urban fantasy groups, and you're talking about, someone asked for, could you give me your top 10 list of authors for this genre? And if it's horror or urban fantasy, not so much urban fantasy, but if it's horror, it's mostly men. We see, we know all the big names. I'm not going to mention them here. But it's the same old list, isn't it? It's the same with epic fantasy. It's the same old list, and it's mostly men and white men. So this might be a Captain Obvious question, but do you think one of the reasons why the misogyny and sexism that underpins the negative female stereotypes in horror is because it's still a male-dominated genre or still feels like one. Linda?
Well, one of the things that I was thinking about too, as I was listening to Nick and Kenesha, is that I have often talked about for years now the fact that what makes the difference is the gatekeepers, right? If again, who are reading and making the decisions on what's going to be published? That is where you get, and Nick, when he talked about the white gaze, it just reminded me of Toni Morrison, because she says that too. It's like, who is looking at it and what ruler are they using to judge it? Who's to say this story is horror enough because they're looking at it as it's a female story and it just doesn't fit what their view of what a horror story should be. So an example of that I wanted to bring up was Sycorax's Daughters, where I was one of the 3 women who were the editors. The other 2 were professors, and it was actually Professor Kenesha Brooks who conceived the idea of it. But when we went to look for women to put into this Black anthology of horror, poetry, and short stories, I immediately went to magazines like, Ebony or whatever, Black magazines, because you know what? There's a lot of horror living Black in America. And there's a lot of the stories in there were reactions to relationships, because women are dealing with a lot of horror in relationships. They're dealing with a lot of pressure with having children or not having children. So you're not going to get that view if you're always reading the same people and you're looking at it through the same glass. You need to have people reading and reaching out that look different. Like Kenesha said, if you don't see yourself, then how are you going to actually, unless you're just stubborn like me, because literally I am one of the most stubborn, could care less people about that situation. But but that's just me. Not everybody's stubborn like that, So I think the intimidation, the self-intimidation can change if you start changing who the editors are, who the readers are, who the people are who are taking this into account. Like yourself, Regina, when you were putting this together, you had a view of what you wanted this book to represent. And that's what you ended up with, is a wonderful collection, a mix of things, So that's a big thing, I think.
Well, here's the thing that guided me and Rebecca, the editor, Rebecca Brewer, the editor, is who does violence against women affect? Pretty much everybody, either directly, doesn't matter what your ethnic group or race is, doesn't matter what your class is, doesn't matter where you're from. You're a woman, cis or trans, you're going to experience it at least once in your life, probably in intervals throughout your life. So that's why the TOC reflects that, and also reflects the fact that men also get affected by it, because the community gets the secondhand, it's the secondhand violence, the PTSD, everything reverberates out from the incidences of violence. So let's go to Kenesha. So Kenesha, what do you think?
I think kind of what Linda was saying also about who's looking at the stories and what they classify as horror. Like she said, some people are like, oh, this is a domestic story. This is a women's issue story. This isn't a horror story, but they are horror stories, So I think if your ideal is, slasher type things, and then that's what you're thinking horror is, or if you're thinking it's got to be a monster, or if you're thinking there's got to be some, male hero, then you won't even consider those other stories. And I think, like Nick said, we're kind of in the middle lane where people are considering those other stories now, that horror doesn't just have to look one way, that, a lot of life experiences. And like Linda said, dealing with, the intersection of being Black and being a woman, there are a lot of horror stories that come out of that, So, that was a great, anthology, because there is a lot of horror that women deal with, that, and when you're intersectional and you have race on top of that, lots of horrific instances and how we process those. And like you said in your introduction, horror, gives people a way to process their own trauma And if you're not even seeing your own trauma reflected in literature so that you can process it in a safe, contained way, that contributes more to your PTSD, because it's, am I invisible? Am I invisible?
Yeah, and there's a comment from the audience. Kenesha makes a good point. There are so many types of horror stories. Horror doesn't have to look one way. So bring up the rear. Nick, what do you think?
First of all, I think that's a great comment, and I think that just as a theme, as an idea, it's really, it's well said and perfect, and we should all frame it and put it on our wall. As for the misogyny and sexism in horror, I think the question sort of does answer itself, because it was at one time, and maybe still is, a male-dominated genre. I think a lot of horror that has been written recently is based on is by writers who read a lot of horror in the 80s or 70s, or saw a lot of 70s and 80s horror movies. And 99.9% of those books and films were by men who quite clearly, if you watch them with a modern eye, do not understand women, maybe have never met a woman. And it's particularly galling when there is sexual violence in these films, because it is not presented as violence. It is presented as titillation. Even when the whole point of the movie is that this happens and then there's revenge afterwards, which there were a number of those. But they still, the camera was still very much the male gaze. The camera would linger lovingly on the body of the woman, even as this violence was being done to them. And so I think that got into the DNA of horror, because these movies and books were huge. And it's taking a lot of work to exorcise that from the horror genre and from people's subconscious as they write horror. I think, speaking as a writer myself, I get lazy sometimes, and I know that I'm pulling from just lazy, top of the brain ideas that have come to me from reading other horror books or from watching horror movies. And you got to sort of put in that extra effort, right, to move through that and not rely on those things, especially when they are misogynistic or sexist or hurtful in some way. The answer to that question is yes. It is this is there because of the male dominance of the genre. I really am happy to see so many more women writing horror now than I ever have before, and from so many different backgrounds. And I think that is one of the ways that we will exorcise this from the genre, is through their work.
Yeah, and so picking up from what Nick said, Linda, do you think that the rising number of female horror authors, new ones such as Carmen Maria Machado, Alma Katsu, and Lee Murray, coming to prominence in the past decade, will help with getting rid of the worst of female stereotypes and tropes in horror?
Well, I think that is that creation that they're doing, and Lee and others are bringing in other cultures. As has been said, and no one's story of horror is the same. So what's more interesting is to read some other new view of it. That's what really draws me as a reader, and whether it's a movie or book or whatever, is I enjoy watching something different. So I think the creation is a way to put that energy out there. How to get rid of things, I don't even know. I mean, honestly, I wish I knew, because I don't know how you get rid of it other than putting out the different things. Like Nick says, I never call him Nicholas. So I'm like,
I was surprised.
I know for too many years you and I have known each other, but anyway, I digress. So the point is that it's not so much a matter of getting rid of as much as putting out there things that all of a sudden their work is winning these awards, their work is getting these attention. And my hope is things crawling into dark corners that don't need to be out there anymore. And if they do come out there, then we have people calling them out, and not just women. There's a lot of men, Nick is one of them. There's a lot of men in the industry of like, yeah, I don't really need that to be the case.
Yeah. Kenesha?
Yeah, I agree. I think more women coming coming to the forefront, like Linda said, winning awards, getting movies made from their work because it brings it to a wider audience. I think things like that will push us forward. I think there's a lot of female horror authors right now that are really pushing forward. Mercedes Yardley does beautiful horror. Eden Royce bringing in the hoodoo culture into her horror. Samantha Kolesnik, I hope I've got her name right. I think her novel debuted last year, and it was, so people said it was very brutal for a female author. It had a female villain, but I thought it was amazing and showing that, women can be bad guys too, so showing a female villain. So Zinni Rockland coming out with Tor Nightfire and her short, I think it was a novella that came out, but I think she has a novel coming out with them. So we are getting different perspectives out there. And I think just the more that are published and the more people can see, because I think, I know, especially for movies, women and people of color actually go to horror in larger numbers in perspective with their population size. So we are watching these movies, females are watching horror, women are watching horror, and we want to see ourselves reflected. And I think that's happening more. I really do. I think with movies, I think Blumhouse is doing a really good job at putting out great female writers and directors with their movies, and having feminist takes on different movies like Black Christmas that came out, I think in 2019. The years get smushed together with COVID. Which was considered one of the first slasher films, and, remaking it with a feminist bent and showing, what happens with sexual violence on campuses. And, there were things that women felt like they could see themselves in that movie. So there was a quote from an article, and one of the girls takes her keys and puts them in her hand as a weapon when she's walking across campus. They said they'd never seen that in a movie before, but they know almost every woman they know does it. So I think we're moving forward by having more women entering the field.
Mm-hmm. Nick?
My hope is that as more and more female authors and authors of color publish well and get noticed and win awards, that those same editors who were sort of blind before will start taking notice of them and say, well, I want these award-winning authors in my anthologies. I want these best-selling authors in my anthologies. That's my hope. I think it's a bigger hurdle maybe than I think it is, but that's my hope. But at the same time, like Kenesha just said, somebody had this idea that this book was so brutal for a female author. Like that obviously still speaks to certain stereotypes that are still out there about what is expected from women versus what is expected from men. And so I think we still obviously have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, we do. I was, internally, Kenesha, when you said that, I was like rolling my eyes. It's like, do you even know what we are capable of?
Right.
Oh, Linda.
I just wanted to also add, because I made a note, I didn't want to forget to say this. Kenesha's been putting out some great videos about the process of being a creative person. And I really think things like that aren't even obvious, to have a different face talk about creating and the challenges, the pluses, the minuses is really important also.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Kenesha, do you have a link for that? You could also type it in a private chat.
Okay, I will. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so while Kenesha's doing that, we have a question from the audience. And she's a newbie to author, so to horror. Sorry, guys, to horror. My pandemic brain is getting the better of me today. So let's put the question from the audience on screen. So Misty 306, hi Misty. Why is it that I have never heard of the final girls trope until recent horror books were released? It makes sense, but it seems I should have known about this trope due to horror movies. Linda?
First of all, I pulled this out because I was like, oh my God, I forgot about this. This is poetry written by Claire Holland, and it's called I Am Not Your Final Girl. She goes through it, man. She goes through the movies and everything. I love this book so much. I get chills when I hold it. I think the reason that we're starting to talk about it now is the same reason that conversation started talking about why the Black person in a movie always got to be the first one to die. It's a walk of shame. And people don't like to talk about shameful things, but that's how you heal it. So the final girl thing is being talked about in the last few years, but it's happened from the beginning, from the very first Frankenstein mummy movie, where that woman was running and falling and stumbling and waiting for somebody to save her. That was like 60, 70 years ago, so yeah, it's been around a lot, but it's just starting to come into conversation as not being cool.
Yeah. Kenesha?
Yeah, and I think it's kind of getting like meta now. Like I want to say there's like maybe like 6 books with like Final Girl in the title right now if you go to Amazon. And Scream was the first movie that got meta about the final girl trope, and shocked us in different ways that we hadn't seen before in a slasher film, and where the slasher wasn't really the main character. Because if you think about a lot of slasher films like Freddy and Jason and Michael Myers, they're really the hero. They're the ones that people are actually rooting for them to like kill all these kids and everything. But Scream made, I think her name was Sydney, made Sydney the hero. She was the final girl, but she was the hero. We weren't rooting for the slasher in this film.
Yeah. Isn't it a little sick that we're, rooting for the slasher instead of, the people he's killing? Oh, okay. So Nick, any thoughts?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, the term "final girls" I think has been around since, I don't know, the late 80s or early 90s. I think it was actually coined in a book called "Women and Chainsaws" or something along that something like that. I'm probably not getting the title right, but it's funny thinking about the idea of final girls. It was always viewed or always explained to me, probably by other men, that the final girl is a very feminist idea. She has gone through this trial by fire, as it were, and she has come out the other side stronger and changed and transformed. But you can't get away from the fact that so many of those films where the final girl that have final girls were still viewed through the male gaze. We're still all about, most of the female characters are there to be girlfriends or love interests or to have a shower scene or just to get killed. So it's a strange concept to try to twist final girl as a feminist idea within something that is so clearly misogynistic.
Yeah, and sorry.
No, it's okay.
No, and I just wanted to say that why should we put female characters through the ringer like that just to be able to declare in the end that they're strong women or something? We're strong in ourselves. We don't need to be chased around by monsters and traumatized and have all that flung at us before at the end we survive. It seems to be like the story of being a woman sometimes. We have to get all these hurdles and yeah. So anyway, going back to what Linda was saying just now, Linda brought up the subject of shame. So, and the issue of violence against women, people don't talk about it. Historically, it has been seen as shameful and taboo for public discussion, which is why many advocates and activists talk about the wall of silence around the violence. Yet in popular culture, including horror, violence against women has been a staple part of stories with a multitude of brutal tropes, ranging from witches, which demonize powerful women, to brutal gang rapes, to femicide motivated by misogyny and male violence. Now, how can horror counteract stories and storytelling tropes in pop culture that normalize violence against women to the point of glorifying it as entertainment for the masses? Linda.
The first thing I was thinking of, and again, it's hard to speak for everyone other than wanting everyone to have some sense of mindfulness when they create something, like be aware of what you're creating. And then if you do walk down a certain, like, automatic way of thinking, like Nick says, you got to be conscious that you're doing something unconsciously, and then you can change it. Then you can be more aware, that you can add more dimensions to it that aren't just cliched. I mean, I know that I've been interviewed about my horror work, and a lot of it poetry, and I, without making a decision, just because who I am, I don't have a lot of victims in my work. I'm not saying I don't have women that haven't been victimized in my work. I'm saying that they're not victims. There's a difference between that. And that's one thing I think, like if I had to talk to somebody and say how to do this, like they don't have to be victims. They don't have to be victimized. Society, something can come at them, but the strength of the human spirit is not involved in sexual orientations and parts. It's like, it's there if you're human. So, I think that would be something important to concentrate on as a creator.
Kenesha?
I think when you show the after effects of violence, that's a powerful, anti-trope, anti-stereotypes, because a lot of times these women go through the ringer. You never see them the next day. You never see them in their therapist's office where they have to have therapy for 20 years because they're the final girl. So I think showing that violence affects the victim. It's not just something that just happens to them and then it's over, and I think that's a more interesting story anyway. What happens after that, instead of just, kill, and, this body count racking up. What about the psychological effects of violence, and, not lingering the camera, whether that's the literal camera or, the reader's eye in your story, not lingering on the violence. I think that's when it becomes, titillation and not just something that happens in the story or something when you're, glorifying it or you're purposely putting it in there for people that is, something that titillates them versus, trying to really tell a story where you're trying to sensationalize violence against women as, something that is almost, erotic sometimes in some horror.
Nick?
I agree 100%. Show the after effects of violence, show the realism of violence, and sort of take away the glorification of it by showing how grueling and awful it really is. And I think one way that horror can definitely counteract this sort of misogyny and violence against women that seems to be so interwoven into its genes is to stop sexualizing it. I can't tell you how many movies I've seen, and I'm not even talking about movies from the 80s. I'm talking about movies now where every female victim was pretty much naked, right? Or in a book, there's a weird sexual tinge to the way the violence is done. If we could really get authors to consciously understand and consciously be aware because they may not even realize they're drawing from this, but to be aware if they are sexualizing the violence against women and what they're writing, I think that would go a long way to counteracting it.
Yeah, it's. I don't know about other people, but whenever I read horror or watch horror, especially the older ones, I keep thinking, why do you have to put sex in this? Why? Why? It can be scary without adding, sex or titillation and violence, rape and sexual assault at that. And what's disturbing is at one point, I'm not sure about all of you, but at one point I was just so inured to it, I just went, oh, right, sex scene, so I just skipped it. That's disturbing because we shouldn't be inured to it, right? We shouldn't be inured to sexual violence. But anyway, so speaking of titillation, so violence against women in horror has been used by authors and filmmakers to hook their readers and audiences. Do you think it's possible that the usage of violence against women for titillation and edginess will eventually change as the wider conversation about pushing back against victim blaming and rape culture sparked by Me Too keeps growing? Linda.
I think that that is the path to some change. Again, it's a slow path. I mean, the answer to your question I was thinking of that you mentioned just before that is because especially the early stuff was books and movies made and written by men for men. So if you said to someone, would you put your mother, your daughter, your sister in that? They're not thinking about that as a concept. They're thinking they're writing this for some guy that's like them or not like them or whatever. So I think there's a slow, um, uh, again, movement, and it'll be an increase as more and more women are getting attention, as more and more women's work is getting out there, to the fact that that's not necessary. Again, why do you have a sex scene in anything unless it's relevant to the character or the storyline? Why?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and the same thing, I mean, that's what I ask myself. I'm not saying every creator should, but everything should be towards building the character, the story, the changes that are happening. But it's too easy, I think, for a lot of people to just go with what they've been learning from what they've read and seen and go forward with that. But there's a lot of places now in movies and books where people are asking for more, are standing up and saying, all this is this. And if that's what you want, then as long as you know that's what you're getting, okay. You know, so.
Kenesha?
I agree. And I also think that as people recognize that the audience is changing, they'll have to change. They'll get left behind. You know, like Linda said, if you were just writing for men before, you can't do that anymore. You know, you can't do that anymore. It's not just a male world, you know? So I think that, you know, it's slowly moving. I think, yes, a lot of these social movements will help show that that's not okay anymore, that it's not okay to casually have sexual violence or to casually have misogyny in the work anymore. So I think those people will start looking like dinosaurs because we are moving forward as a culture.
They're really loud dinosaurs though, Kenesha.
Yeah.
They're really loud and sometimes violent dinosaurs. Nick, any thoughts?
I think anything that raises awareness will create change down the road. We're seeing it already, and I think it will seep into the creative arts as well, including writing. But it's not on the Me Too movement or any movement. So much of this will come down to writers, particularly male writers, being conscious of what they're writing and trying to do differently and trying to do better. And I think it's hard to put all one's eggs in that basket, but I think it's really going to come down to writers just trying to do better and being conscious. And I think there are still so many writers out there that are unconscious of these things. And I hope that raising awareness in the society around them, at least, will help them gain a level of consciousness about it.
So speaking of movies, let's talk about movies. So in recent years, there have been an increasing number of horror and horror influenced shows, such as Mike Flanagan's adaptation of The Haunting of Hill House, and the recent reboot of Candyman by Nia DaCosta, which center female protagonists and tackle the issue of toxic masculinity and how dangerous it is not just to women, but also the fabric of society. So the trope of female rage and revenge against violent men and misogyny is currently on the rise, also with movies such as Promising Young Woman. Do you think there's a similar trend emerging in horror fiction? Linda.
I didn't want to jump in. I wanted to make sure you had a chance to finish what you were saying. But I think there is. And again, the balance of things, right? You know, it's easy to overdo. So I'm all about showing that not only can female characters be strong, they can be vengeful. they can have anger, but it's got to be sort of a balance of it, not to the point where it also then becomes titillating. Like, ooh, what's getting ready? Like some kind of an exciting thing. I'm not saying we shouldn't enjoy movies and books that we read, because I do. I think it should be interesting. We're not writing sociological, we're not consciously writing sociological essays, but there's got to just be sort of a balance of how much that is before it becomes a thing. So I think it's a interesting road to walk on. The subject in a different kind of way has been about Black movies and stuff coming out about violence against Blacks and slavery and so forth. I mean, there's a point where that's interesting and thought-provoking, and then there's a point where it just becomes like a thing, and it's not. So I think the balance is really important.
Okay, everyone, if you notice that I've been acting a bit weird, it's because my camera can't seem to focus properly.
Did you have a question?
I know, it's like Linda was looking at me weird because I was like putting my palm there. I was trying to get the camera to focus, and this is one of the downsides of actually doing this online, because sometimes cameras just don't. Oh yeah, here I am. I'm focused. Yeah. So camera is.
You're in focus now.
Now, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So going back to the question, Kenesha, what do you think?
I agree with Linda. I think one of the things that can happen a lot is that it will become a thing for a while, because people like to harp on, oh, this is what's selling now, so we're all going to move in this direction because this is what's selling now, versus realizing that we just want diverse perspectives. We don't need all of the same perspectives. They don't all need to be, revenge fantasies, even though sometimes we like those. We need diverse perspectives in film and movies. And I think that, I don't know who follows the other, whether it's books following movies first or movies following books first. But, I am seeing different horror than I've seen before. Like I said, I think Blumhouse does a really good job. And I wanted to mention before I forgot. So like for Halloween, for the October season, they used to do a series with Hulu called Into the Dark. And then now they're doing it with Amazon. And they have one that's called Black as Night. It has a Black female vampire slayer in it, and they're doing another one with Gigi Saul Guerrero, who is doing Bingo Hell, which has an all-female lead cast, and they're elderly women, so something we haven't seen before. So I think that people are seeing that we want things that we haven't seen before. We've seen the final girl tropes. We've seen women being victims of sexual violence before, and we want something different from our horror. And so I think that, like I said, people have to get on board, or you won't sell anymore. I mean, how many of the same books do you need on your bookshelf if they're all the same?
Nick, thoughts?
I don't think I can put it any better than Linda and Kenesha did. So I'm just going to say this. I haven't seen the new Candyman yet, and I'm dying to see it. It looks so good. Linda, you've seen it?
No.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm excited also.
Yeah. I think it looks amazing. I think it's going to have it's going to be the story through a lens that we haven't seen before, and should have, frankly, seen before. And I think it's it's a perfect example of what Kenesha was talking about just now, about we just want diversified stories. I don't need every story to be about a Holocaust survivor who takes vengeance on the people who are at the concentration camp. I might enjoy that story occasionally, but by the 12th or 13th one, I'm going to be like, okay, let's tell different stories about the Jewish experience. And I think it's the same with violence against women. Yes, there's nothing like a really good revenge story to get the blood pumping and get you cheering at the end. But there's more to being a woman than the violence that is done against women, just as there is more to being Jewish than the Holocaust. And so having more fully rounded stories would be a big plus.
Two things. One, our trusty producer Anusha went and did her Google fool, and you said that you weren't sure about the title of the book, where the final girl's term comes from, and she said that it's Men, Women, and Chainsaws, Gender
Okay.
in the Modern Horror Film by American academic Carol J. Clover.
It's a seminal book on the horror genre, and through a sociological and feminist lens. And I think it's from the early 90s, maybe. Definitely worth reading if you haven't already. All of you in YouTube land, read it.
Okay, and the second thing is, speaking of Black women in horror, I think Tananarive Due has a new series coming out. I think it's something noir, right?
Horror noir, yeah.
Horror noir, yeah. Horror noir is coming out, and 2 of her short stories are being adapted for the screen. I think by herself and her husband Steve Barnes. So that's coming soon. So everyone, keep your eyes peeled for that.
Can't wait for that.
Knows how to tell a good, creepy story without too many victims in them. And the victims are always the right victims. The evil people. So let's transition from movies to how to write better women and how to write better horror. So let's get down to the nuts and bolts of how storytelling in horror can subvert and even eradicate negative female stereotypes and tropes. So how have horror authors who have attempted to tackle negative female stereotypes and tropes in their stories done so in the past? Linda?
You're asking how it's been done in the past, or how to better do it? I'm sorry. I wanted to be sure.
How it's done how past authors have attempted to do it, whether they're successful or not.
Okay, so before there was consciousness of wanting to do this, it broke into like a cliche situation, right? Girl's always running, she's waiting for a hero, she falls down, the monster gets her, doesn't get her, whatever. So that's like a cliched sort of cardboard character. And I think what's happened is, as writers are becoming more mindful, is what really should happen, because you know what makes a good story? A 3-dimensional character. And that's really what it comes down to, is writing a good character. And so, you know, I think that a lot of what you're seeing are people trying to understand how to write female characters that are 3-dimensional. They're not cliched, and they have reasons, non-reasons, emotionally, psychologically, for things that they're doing. They have needs and desires for things that they want, and things cost in order to get. This is basic character writing. And I think what is happening is that the basics of what makes a good character is starting to be applied outside of the obvious accepted male characters. Like, you know, so I think that is what, in my mind, when I think about it, is what is happening in the process.
Kenesha?
Yeah, I agree with Linda. I think, and what Nick was saying before about how people tried to make the final girl a feminist trope, you know, kind of trying to retrofit it into feminism. But I think that some authors really felt that they were doing a service to women by putting us through the ringer and then having us come out triumphant. You know, I think they were applying, you know, their idea of the hero's journey to a woman, but without, like Linda said, without making her 3-dimensional, without really telling us who she was, instead of just the person running from the monster or running from the bad guy. So I think people are actually realizing women are people, you know, like I think that's the thing. I talked to Grady Hendrix, because I think he writes great female characters in his horror. In fact, most of his books have female main characters. And he said, you know, I write them as people, you know, and that's what you have to do. We're not caricatures, we're not stereotypes, we are people. And if you realize that, you know that our motivations are deeper than just running and tripping, you know, and so I think that's what authors can do, is realize that we're not stereotypes, we're not caricatures, we are real people, and write us as such.
Oh, speaking of Grady Hendrix, there's a comment from the audience that relates to Grady Hendrix. I haven't read the book yet, but when I read the synopsis for the Final Girl support group, that was when I realized that it was a trope in horror movies. As for books, I'm a bit of a scaredy cat. All right, Nick, what's your take on that?
I think Linda has it absolutely correct when she says that it's all about writing fully formed characters, three-dimensional characters. You know, for a long time, the only female characters in horror literature were the vampire brides or the bride of Frankenstein, right? Or they were love interests. They were just the love interests. They would be they'd be tagging along. They had no particular skill that was going to help solve the problems. They would wind up getting kidnapped at the end, and then the hero would have to go and rescue her. And the book ends with, a kiss or whatever. Like, that's how it was for so long. The pendulum started to swing in the other direction, I think, in the mid to late 90s, where it was like, okay, now I'm going to write really strong women, and they wear muscle shirts and they carry big guns and they chew cigars, and you realize that what they're actually writing is a male character with a female name. Like, they still are not understanding what a woman is like, or you know what I mean. It's that feeling that they've never met an actual woman before. And I think that pendulum is now pointing where it's supposed to be, which is fully formed characters. Women are people. They're not exactly like men, and men are not exactly like women. They're fully formed people, but they have their own interests and desires, and they have careers, and they have skills, and they don't have to be rescued anymore at the end of the story. I've seen it the other way around. I've seen some stories where the female character rescues the male character, and even though that's so a trope, it's like, it was just so refreshing to see because it was different. And I think we all, I think that's what it comes down to. We're all so excited to finally see things that are different, that are not the same story we've read over and over again, or the same movie we've saw over and over again. We're seeing different stories because they're being told through different lenses that we haven't seen these stories told through before. And it's so exciting.
Yeah. Oh, Linda.
So I wanted Nick to put in a couple sentences about his own creation of female characters, because I've always enjoyed his work very much. Like I said, Nick and I've known each other a long time, and no doubt if we could have a whole panel on the development of each other's work over time. But I would like to hear, Nick, sort of like, just not a lot, but like your approach to creating a full female character or whatever, because you do a good job.
Is it okay, Regina, if we take this tangent just real quick?
Because we're actually going to talk about this. Like, you're just leaping ahead of the question. And after you talked about it, we can go talk about it also with Linda and Kenesha. So
okay, all right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Linda. That's very kind of you. And we have known each other a long time, and I'm a big fan of your work as well, and of you as a person. I don't know that there is any sort of magic spell to create for a man to write a well-rounded female character. I think it is just an approach of like, well, what would a normal person do in this situation, right? Like the series I've got going now, the book just came out last week called The Hungry Earth, and the main character is a female doctor who is also the medical examiner for this small city in the Hudson Valley. And so she has a ton of skills. She knows science, she knows biology, she knows all this stuff. And so when the poop hits the fan in the story, she has the skills to address it and to try to change it. She calls upon other people for help, because that's what real people do also. But she's not helpless. She's not like, oh, I need to be protected or I need to be rescued. She is doing her job and using her skills and just being a person. I don't know how better to put it than that. And it's frustrating because I'd love to be able to lay out, like, here are the 7 ways to write, a realistic female character, but it's not like that. It's just constantly asking yourself, what would a normal, actual person do? I don't mean to use the word normal, but what would like an actual human being do? And if your first instinct is like, well, she's gonna chomp off the end of a cigar and pick up her AK-47. Maybe that's an interesting character. I don't know, but it doesn't seem realistic.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add something to that. You know, Nick and I, when Lovecraft Country came out, Nick and I had this discussion about Lovecraft Country, and I had another discussion with a friend of mine who's a Black woman, and we were talking about how we were cheering on the female character, the main female character, because there was this scene where they were besieged by the monsters, right? And so she managed to get out, and then she was supposed to get to the car or something, and she just legged it. She ran. She didn't stop to look back. She ran,
and then she didn't trip.
Yes.
And we both noted. My friend and I noted that she didn't do what a lot of the final girls or female characters in horror movies do, which is trip or at some crucial point or stop to look back or something. She just legged it. And that would be what a normal person would do. Like, you're not going to stop and look behind and see if you're going to run. And we thought that was one of, and you know, Lovecraft Country's showrunner is Misha Green. She knew we don't stop and look back at monsters. We run. And that's what normal people do, right? You don't stop and make yourself, and make yourself the potential victim. You try not to be the victim. If someone's chasing you and trying to do you harm, you run. So I just wanted to interject that because Nick mentioned about normal people. So Kenesha, what are your thoughts on all this?
I agree. I mean, thinking about how real people react in real situations versus, trying to fit into some trope. I think that's the first step also. And I think that, giving women agency, like they said, not just being the girlfriend, not just being, the sexual part of the film, or book, will always be a better character than just, some cardboard cutout that you think, a female character should be. I mean, we're all three-dimensional people. We all have our own hopes and dreams, and that's way more interesting to where we care about the character. You don't care about a cardboard cutout, but you do care about a character that feels real to you. So yes, making them a real person is the best way to make a female character.
Linda?
I just I didn't know what Nick was going to say, but I knew it was going to be interesting, and that was the way to go. And I think anytime, for me as a writer, I like doing something different. If I'm doing the same one, I'm bored. So I'm pretty sure the reader's going to be bored. This is my point of view. So the story I have in Giving the Devil His Due, originally when I wrote that story, the main cat, and it has gods and it has goddesses in it and stuff, because I just like that. But anyway, the main character was a woman, but she wasn't in a wheelchair. But this one, the character is in a wheelchair. Why? Because when I wrote the story, I was looking at it like, this needs something different. And I decided to put her in a wheelchair. Now, her being in a wheelchair was not the main part of the story, but it was a different kind of character. And in order for me to write that character, I watched videos on how you move around in a wheelchair. So I got the language right. I watched a video on fighting in a wheelchair because I had a fight in there, and I'm not going to just assume she's in a wheelchair, she can't fight, And then I also read blogs about people in wheelchairs, because from their point of view, the world looks real different than it does from our point of view. And I didn't want to make the assumption that I would be like, if I was in a wheelchair, I want to walk. Well, you know what? That's me, my point of view. If I lived in a wheelchair my whole life, that's not the overarching concept of my being. So I think the idea is that, yes, everyone is human. And when you write a character that's not you, in order to make them not cliched, you just give them the levels that they need in order to make the story. If the story's about a weak character, I'm personally not that interested. If they're weak from the beginning to the end of the story, I'm like, oh, okay, whatever.
Hmm. So how can what are the if a horror author who hasn't written about violence against women before, you're all now going hey because it's so common. I mean, it's common to include violence against women in horror stories. If a budding horror author has not written about violence against women before and is thinking of including it in his, her, or their story, what would your advice be in order for them to avoid the pitfalls that have befallen everyone else who've come before them? Kenesha?
I think making it not the focus of the story. I think also making it not the impetus for a male character. I know that's been done a lot, where it's the man fighting for, you know, vengeance against the harm that was done to this woman, and then you never see the woman again. You know, she's dead, or she's in the hospital or whatever, but he's the hero. So I think thinking about that, I think thinking about not making the violence for titillation, making it, you know, integral to the story, because I'm not one of those people that think that there shouldn't be any stories about violence against women, or stories, or some people say I don't want to. I understand if you don't want to read stories about rape because it can be triggering or things like that, but I don't think we should stop writing them because it is a fact of life. I mean, I forgot what the statistics are. I think it's 1 in 5, but I'm sure the number is higher.
1 in 5 in the US, probably more worldwide.
Right. So it's something that happens, and I think that if you don't write about it, you're ignoring it and trying to act like it doesn't happen, but not making that a source of titillation, but making it, you know, the real issue that it is. So I think when you write with violence against women in your story, it can't be to titillate the reader. It can't be as the impetus for the male character. As we said before, we should see some after effects of it. Somebody mentioned the Final Girls Support Group with Grady Hendrix, and I started reading it. I'm not finished yet, so no spoilers for me. But it is about the after effects of being a final girl. You know, they're in therapy. It is a support group, and what that looks like when violence has been enacted on you. So I think that's what new writers or old writers that want to change the way they write can do.
Linda?
I think I'm going to go and stay in the area that I was talking about when I decided to put a wheelchair character in my story. You know, I mean, again, the story wasn't about her being in a wheelchair. That wasn't the point of it. But that was her as a person. And it came in to play with some of the conversation and motivations. What Kenesha and Nick have said during this time when we were talking is that, yes, when there is violence against a person, a woman, there are after effects, there are side effects, there are things to be worked through. If you're not aware of any of that, then I highly suggest searching online. You can read blogs from women who have actually gone through some of the things you're thinking about writing about, and see what some of their journey as they try to process those things are, in case you don't know, because not everybody does. I'm not going to go with that. I'm always reading stuff to learn more. So I think, you know, do some research, you know, without making it a thing. It's not a bad idea. And the best situation you can do is, if that is a big part of what you're writing, if you can find someone to read it from that. You don't have to have a woman who's gone through the violence you're writing, but you can have a woman read it and see if it makes sense, what you're trying to communicate.
Nick?
I agree that with Linda's last point, like having other eyes on a story is always a good idea for any number of reasons, and definitely to make sure that there's verisimilitude. The advice that I would give somebody would be to just be conscious and be mindful and really show what violence does to a person, really show what the after effects of violence are, show the realistic aspects of violence. It's so true that in so much horror, the violence is done and then the killer moves on. And we never really see the after effects from the victim or the victim's loved ones. And so violence is real. Violence is awful. Violence affects a lot more people than just the one who has had violence done to them. So I would definitely, and I love the idea that Linda had of doing research, of finding blogs and stuff to draw inspiration and verisimilitude from. I think that's a great idea.
Mhm. And going from that, how can horror authors engage with the issue of violence against women in their stories and explore justice for victims, as y'all did in your stories for the anthology, without sounding preachy or prescriptive? Linda.
Oh, um, um, huh. I think the important thing when you're writing anything, but in particular this, is what is your authentic reaction? You know, what is your actual authentic reaction to the story you're telling that is reflective of violence against women, if, and that's what you're putting down? You know, what is, if that character was your mother, your sister, your wife, you know, your daughter, how do you feel inside authentically about that? And by using that authentic emotional sense, I feel like you can write a more three-dimensional story, a story that rings truer, that is going to touch character, that's going to touch the readers more.
Mm-hmm. Kenesha?
I agree, and going back to having verisimilitude and having it feel real. I think that's always important. There's always sensitivity readers and other people who have experienced the things that you're writing about, so that you get it right. So that you're respectful of who you're writing about. I think we talked about this backstage, but my story dealing with sex workers. My mom worked with trafficked women. So, knowing their stories and how they got to where they were and why. I mean, trafficked women don't choose sex work, but there are women that choose sex work. So also hearing both sides, hearing, the sides of women that have chosen sex work versus the women that are brought into it through illegal means, so that you're respectful of that as well. So I think, talking to people and getting other perspectives and in your work is what will make it better, what will make it richer, and what will make it ring true to your readers.
Mm-hmm. And Nick?
Yeah, stay authentic to the emotions, stay in the mind of the character. Try to avoid pulling back into an omniscient voice that says, "Well, now you see what violence does," and stuff like that. But you can listen. We live in a world where you can bust your butt making sure that you are not sounding preachy, and there are people who are going to read that story and say, "Well, this was very preachy," right? Because it's got a message to it, and maybe it's a message that they don't want to hear or that they are resistant to, and so that, well, this was too preachy for me. So it's all you can do is try. All you can do is keep trying, do your best, and there's always going to be people out there pushing back the wrong way.
The one so bad review we got on Amazon One was actually complaining about this.
Yeah,
That it
yeah,
was
I saw it.
preachy. Oh wow.
Yeah, there was only one. Everyone else was like, "This is great. It's catharsis. Like we can read this and feel so, at least feel better about things, without being violent ourselves." There are actually a couple of reviews that said that. So we've achieved it, and we've had survivors, who review it, or survivors who write in going, "Thank you so much for writing these stories." They actually get it right. Yeah.
I'm glad.
So,
I'm glad it's reaching readers and that they are appreciating it.
yeah. Someone said that it was like a train wreck, but an important train wreck that, like, you can't look away from it. The horror of it, it's real. It's the train wreck everyone needs to see, but nobody wants to talk about. It's just talking. She said it might not be the right term to use, train wreck, but it's both fascinating and horrifying, and it makes you think.
Good.
So we achieved that, at least for at least one or two readers. So speaking about books and reviews, so we've come to the final question of this session. So what horror books and films would you recommend that aspiring writers read or see to see good examples of female characters and violence against women in horror being handled well? Linda.
Oh man, I am not good with this. I mean, I had the question, but I'm so, ooh. Come back to me.
Okay, Kenesha?
Okay, I'm gonna go with Grady Hendrix, We Sold Our Souls. I really, really enjoyed that book. I really enjoyed the female main character. She was three-dimensional in all the best ways. Movies, I would recommend. Ooh, this is hard. I was trying to Black Christmas, the 2019 version. I would recommend that. I feel like it definitely shows violence through a female lens instead of a male lens. This is hard, like Linda said. This is so hard. So I'm just going to go with those two right now.
Okay, Nick?
For movies, what springs to mind immediately for me was the movie The Witch, which I think came out in 2015, which is very much about a repressive society. It's about a young woman growing up in a repressive society and repressive family. I can't recall if any physical violence was done to her. I think her mother slaps her a few times. But it's very much about her coming into her own and transcending. Literally, at the end, she transcends beyond this society. It's beautiful and it's spooky and it's really incredibly well done. In terms of books, I would recommend the short fiction of Livia Llewellyn, who always writes about female characters and is very good at writing three-dimensional, realistic, and very frightening female characters. Her work is also tends to lean towards the erotic a lot, but it's not sexualized violence against women. Like, she takes a different approach to it, and I think a lot of aspiring writers could learn a lot from her.
Okay, Linda?
Okay, I got something. There's so many things. Okay, movies. I kind of liked Us, the movie Us. I thought it had like a whole different view of like humans and things misbehaving and stuff. And then I'm reading this book, Sleeping with a Monster by Anya Martin, and it's a bunch of stories. It's actually 12 stories, 12 women, 12 horrors, and it's involving love. But I like very much how she has made it interesting, real characters. It doesn't throw me out. Like, literally, I've watched things I don't even want to mention now on Netflix, and I'm like, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard anybody do. Why you write the dumb character, and I can't go with it. So I'm in for the win with Anya Martin's book, Sleeping with the Monster.
You talk to the TV when you watch it?
I do. That's what happens. That's what happens when you don't have live pets. You have stuffed animals, and you look at yourself. I do. I'm like, I'm done with you. Click, and I go do dumb things. I can't handle a dumb character doing dumb things. No.
I shouldn't. I'm in a glass house. I shouldn't throw stones because, with Lovecraft Country, like me yelling at the TV, run! Yeah. So before we wrap up, a quick reminder to everyone that if you're interested in getting your very own copy of Giving the Devil His Due, which has stories from Linda, Kenesha, and Nick, you can order it from all major booksellers worldwide, including Amazon, Kobo, Google Play, Book Depository, and more. And I'm going to share this slide on screen. There we go. So you can get it from all major booksellers worldwide, and we would advise you, strongly recommend at least that you put in your order today, because there are supply chain issues. There's a paper shortage. There are shipping issues because of the pandemic. And if you want to learn more about the anthology and who's in it and what's it about, go to bit.ly/giving the devil his due. This is case sensitive, so make sure you get it all right. And also, we have teamed up with 12 of the 16 authors to offer a special anthology book plate for early bird buyers. So out of the 3 authors that are here today, Linda and Nick have the book plates, and they are ready to send it to you. When you're ready, they're ready to. Oh yes, Linda has them.
It's coming.
Beautiful.
And right at the bottom, if you notice, everyone, right at the bottom of that book plate is a line that has a link to a global resource from the No More Foundation, the World Bank, and UN Women for victims of domestic violence and sexual assault in 205 countries and territories worldwide. So if you buy the books, send us your receipt, and we will reserve one of the book plates for you, and you can choose who you want the book plate from. So just go to giving the devil is bit.ly/givingthedevil_his_due, click on get a book plate and fill in the form, upload your receipt, and we'll get cracking with that. And also, if you are not into horror, and it's not your cup of tea, we are also currently running our Read for Pixels fundraiser, and I'll share a slide here. We are running a Read for Pixels fundraiser for Domestic Violence Awareness Month right now. Here's the thing. We have plenty of goodies available from authors and publishers from genres as diverse as romance, mystery, young adult, and of course, horror, science fiction, and fantasy. And if you're a budding author watching this session and you want more help with your work, there are plenty of critique sessions and one-to-one workshops for budding writers from authors such as Arkady Martin, Sebastian de Castell, Alaya Dawn Johnson, Sam Hawke, Tori Eldridge, and more. And you can donate to get these goodies on Rally Up at bit.ly/R4P Rally Up 2021. And if you want to learn more about Read for Pixels program, which this anthology and this panel session is part of, go to bit.ly/readforpixels. Now, so far we've raised $4,540, which is 90% of the way to our modest $5,000 goal. So please give generously, because as with the net proceeds from our anthology, all donations to this fundraiser goes towards keeping our anti-violence against women work alive. And to find out more about violence against women and what you can do about it, visit the Pixel Project's website at www.thepixelproject.net. Now, before we call it an evening, Linda, Nick, and Kenesha, do any of you have any events coming up or releases that you would like to announce, starting with Linda?
Coming up, I don't have anything in particular. I mean, what just came out is, what in the world is a poet doing on the cover of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction? I don't know, but I think I like it. So I have 2 poems in here. I've been submitting them forever. And also on the horror line, I have a poem in the Southwest Review, along with a whole lot of other cool people. These links are on my site also. So those are the 2 things.
Okay. Kenesha?
I have in the spring of 2022 a horror comic that is coming out with 133 Publishing. So if you go to 133 Publishing's Facebook page or website soon, they will be putting up preview art for the comic.
Okay. And Nick, I know you have a new book out.
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier. It's called The Hungry Earth. It came out on October 5th, and it's the first in a series of science thrillers that are really horror novels. It's already it was an Amazon and Barnes and Noble bestseller, which is like incredible, unexpected, and really took me by surprise. And I feel very grateful for that. And it just got a great review in Fangoria as well. And as you may know, Fangoria hates everything, so I feel really, really good about this good review.
Okay, so thank you to all 3 of you for being with us tonight. We hope that everyone in the audience has found some useful ideas and hints and tips on how to write your book if you're a horror author, if you're a budding horror author, and some food for thought if you're a horror fan or someone who's new to horror. So thank you all, and have a good day or good night wherever you are in the world.
Good night.
It's been
Thank
a
you.
pleasure. It's been a pleasure.